Today we don't have just a major text to go to. We're going to look at a concept. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about covenant or contract or covenant. It's going to be just a short 2-sermon section as we look at understanding our expectations of our connection to one another and our expectations to God. Sometimes you think. That's all I do. We're considering if our mental expectations are more like a covenant or a contract. So I've divided the sermon, and I thought about lots of different ways to do this. Today I'm going to take a look at, well, how does God connect with us? Does he connect with us in ways of covenant or in contract? And next week, well, how do we connect with God? What happens if we have our view of God as a covenant or a contract? And then I thought I would even complicate things more by, do we think in terms of both contract and covenant? And what's the difference between that mentality, our expectations of God and God's expectations of us, and how those relate together? We're going to begin by looking at concepts of contracts. That's probably the more familiar for us. Not all of our contracts are full legal contracts, right? We also operate with less formal contracts. Whether the contract is formal or informal, the contract is only good as the character of the persons who make it, as we found out when we tried to do an insurance claim for electrical damage in the building. We didn't have the right contract to be able to handle that. It's not wrong or unhealthy to use contracts in your relationships. They're one way of setting up a contract, but you have to listen to the wording. Contracts are, if you, then I will, so that. Those are the typical mindset wording. In a marriage, it may be, if you get the kids ready for bed, I'll get the kitchen cleaned up so that we can watch the movie together tonight. Anything wrong with that? You might negotiate the terms of the contract and say, well, I would rather do that part than this part. But the so that is important. These agreements help us help one another and get things done. But relationships that don't move beyond contracts are bound for frustration, hurt, anger, even separation and divorce. Because I expect that, and I'll only do that with that. Contracts have characteristics. These are the ones that we know. Contracts are usually made for a limited period of time, right? You can remember way back 6 months ago when cell phones had contracts. Phasing out of that. Whether it's a car loan or a mortgage, you sign for a time, and if you vacate the contract early, what happens? Penalties. Sometimes pretty severe penalties, because they don't want you out of the contract. You haven't done the full term. But when God enters, today is about God using these. When God encourages us to enter a contract with him, he uses it, and he says, there's blessings and there's curses. There's sowing and there's reaping. That type of terminology to remind us, here's what I expect from you. If you do it my way, things will be better. If you don't do it my way, things are going to get complicated. Contracts most often deal with specific actions. Some of the actions are required and some are prohibited. You might need to do this, but you're not allowed to do that. God calls us to a holy life and to avoid sin, and we have a few passages in the Bible that you can refer to as virtue and vice lists. Here's the things that I want you to do, the character that you should be, and here's the things that I don't want you to do. Those give us some specifics in those categories. So sometimes God says there's some specific actions involved here. They are based on an if, then, so that mentality, as I said. This is the language of contract. I'm willing to make you happy if you're willing to make me happy. And when it's working, conflict is minimal, but when the actions are lopsided, then conflict quickly escalates. God records some of his promises in Scripture as well as the reasons for his call to action or his avoidance of things, but he often waits for us to take a step of faith before he blesses us. If you take a step of faith, here's the next part. Contracts are motivated by the desire to get what we want. The person who initiates the contract has a gain in mind and a cost that they're willing to pay. The payment has to be lower than the gain, or it won't be offered. If you clean up the kids, I'll take out the trash, but if I have to do the dishes, I'd rather clean up the kids. So I'm willing to do some things, but not other things. This is a key difference in our connection with God. Even when he calls us to make a contract, guess who he has in mind for the benefit? Us. God always has our betterment in mind. If you do it my way, this will be better. Contracts are sometimes unspoken and implied. Sometimes the aspects of the contract are agreed upon without really conversation. This is I did this. Wasn't that kind that I did this for you? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I didn't say what you had to do, but if you wanted to be kind to me, you would figure something out. Does God do that? Did he give you the sunshine today and say, if I do that, then I was kind to you, right? It only rained a little yesterday. I thought that was kind because half the roof was exposed. But he doesn't negotiate that way. God is always clear about his expectations regarding contracts. We know the cost and we know the gain ahead of time, and he leads us through a healthy conscience. God lets us know what he wants of us, and he lays that out front. That's contract. The traits of contract connection can be seen in some aspects of how God connects with his people. In the Old Testament, which is another word for covenant, we read of the blessings and curses. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 26, 16 through 19, page 312 here. God had laid out the contract. Now this section is very much contract. Here's the blessings. Here's what I will do. Here's the curses. You break this, and this is what's coming. And so I've skipped to the end because you can read through the blessings and the curses, the specifics of it, but this is how it wraps it up in 26:16. The Lord your God commands you this day to follow these decrees and laws. Does that sound optional? He commands them to do it, and if they follow his decrees and his laws, things are going to be better for them. But if they don't, they're going to bring difficulty into their own lives. But it's not just the letter of the law. He wants it done in a specific way. He says, carefully observe them with, then what do you see? With all your heart and with all your soul. Don't just obey the letter of the law. Don't just think you're sneaking something by me. I've done this, and I want you to do it for the reason I gave, not just the behavior. You have declared this day that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in his ways, that you will keep his decrees, commands, and laws, and that you will obey him. Because they've just done this back and forth, where they made this agreement with God. The passage goes on to say in verse 18, and the Lord has declared this day that you are his people, his treasured possession, as he promised, and that you are to keep his commands. He has declared that he will set you in his praise, fame, and honor of high above all the nations that he has made, and that you will be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised. It says, you made this promise to follow me. I promise that you are my people. In 27 through 30, God then lays out the blessings and the curses and has them sound them off from one mountain to the other so everybody knows. There's something about reading a contract, seeing a contract, saying a contract. There's no doubt about what they've entered into. God's expectations are very clear for his people as they enter this conditional covenant with him. But to God, this is a binding agreement which he will not forget. They might forget that they did this. That next generation raised up, they don't remember, I wasn't there. I didn't enter this. But who will never forget? God will never forget that these are his people and these are his laws. Because it is a binding contract, it's translated as covenant. As we read the history, we know that a main part of the work of the prophets is to remind the people that they're off track, that they're not meeting the terms of their contract, that they are entering behavior that's going to separate them from God, and that the blessings are available, but the curses are yet to come. The warnings come before the curses begin. Isn't God good about that? The warnings come before the curses begin when we enter a conditional contract with God, so we need to heed the warnings. He says, don't do it. And then we start to do it, and he says, I told you don't do it. There's that grace often that consequence is not just immediate, but it can be. Contracts are conditional. Do we understand contracts? If you do this, then I'll do that. So that. Does God ever enter into contract with us? Yeah, there's some things that he says, if you do this, it's for your benefit. Here's what I'm going to do. But God is a God of covenant as well. Contracts are conditional, but they're not the only way that God connects with his people, because God won't break a contract. God remembers all of this. God knows what he's committed to. God will always follow through. And so he reminds us of covenant. The term covenant is used to differentiate between conditional and unconditional agreements. The biblical word most often translated covenant in Hebrew is berit in the Old Testament. God uses this term 280 times in the Old Testament, and the Greek, diatheke, is used 33 times, where God says, here's a one-sided, here's what I'm going to do, without the expectation of what you're going to do. You will do well to honor it, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm a God of covenant. So I want us to start back in the Old Testament, look at a couple covenants where God says, this is what I'm going to do. Different than a contract, because contract says, I will do this if you will do that. But if either side stops doing their part, the contract's broken. A covenant says, here's what I'm committed to. Here's what I'm going to do. Think back to this one, Genesis chapter 9, 12 through 16. That remind you of any covenant God made? You ever see a rainbow today? What's the promise of that rainbow? Is he ever going to forget that? Did Noah have any response to that? I will put up this rainbow if. No, there's no if in that statement. Genesis 9, 12 through 16. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant. Now look at the wording. I am making between me and you and every living creature with you a covenant for all generations to come. Who's doing the making? I am making. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds. And then interesting, verse 15. It says, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all the living creatures of every kind on the earth. When I see the rainbow, it will remind me. God says, I will be reminded that I made this promise. Notice that Noah has no response to this agreement. This is God making a one-sided agreement for the benefit of the world at a cost to himself. No matter how frustrated he is with the sinfulness of the world, that rainbow reminds him, I made an agreement. I made a covenant that I would not destroy it that way. And every time that rainbow is there, it's a reminder of this one-sided commitment. You see the difference between contract and covenant. Genesis 15, we have a few of these. There's a covenant with Abram before he was Abraham, which I want us to consider as well. In Genesis 15, on page 21, we read that Abram is wondering how he's going to have a promised son and how he's going to enter the promised land. God has said that this is going to occur, but Abram's wondering, well, how? I don't really have confidence that this is in my future. God answers by having Abram offer to God a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon, and split the larger animals and arranging the halves of the animals opposite each other. A little odd image for us. That's in verse 10. So, Abram has sacrificed the larger animals. He has split them in half and he's laid them out opposite and made a path in the middle. Now, God responds to this. He said, you do your part, get the animals ready, because this was a human contract that we're going to talk about. But in verse 12, Genesis 15:12, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. That's interesting to me. A thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they'll be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. You ever have these type of dreams? The first part of the dream is, oh, by the way, what's in your future is your descendants are going into captivity for 400 years. That's the first thing that God tells him during this little dream sequence. And in verse 14, but I will punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. So the good news is, at the end of it, they'll come out with great possessions. I'll take care of that, I'll make things right, and I will bless them. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. So you wonder about your future? I'll take care of you. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So, 4 generations it's going to take, but they're going to come back. I've got this. I'll take care of it. God doesn't give them this lofty idea. He doesn't miss the bad news, a part of the good news. He just tells them, here's what I'm going to do. Here's your future. You're concerned about it. Here's what's going to happen. The good and the bad. And then we have the image. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and went down the middle, passed between the pieces. That's the main vision. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the rivers of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Inites, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Any of the other ites are probably listed in there too. But I will give you this land. They have itis. So what's the deal with the vision? Split animals, and then a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch. And he sees that, and Abram says, wow, it's all going to happen. We may not understand that as a sign of covenant, but what did that image mean? A fire pot and a flaming torch passing between the pieces. Here's how I've had it explained to me. This is a specific type of covenant or contract. So you would take an animal, usually not many, but one, and you would split it and say, here's how serious I am about keeping this contract. We're both going to walk between those. And if either of us breaks it, you can do that to me and I can do that to you. Cut you in half. Is that a pretty serious type of contract? Are you going to do what you can to not fail in that contract? Who's the only one that goes through the animals? God does. God says, you're concerned about your future? You're wondering if I'm going to follow through? May this happen to me if I break this agreement. I'm not going to let you do it because you're going to break the agreement. I'm promising you that I will do this. And that's enough. He has confidence that everything that God had said is going to be true. An interesting way for him to make this contract in a way that is now a covenant. As you can guess, this level of commitment was not made lightly, and Abram knows that. And so he has confidence in it. God is a covenant-making God. We've looked at a few of them. God's covenant with Noah, chapter 6, verse 18. First use of the word and the concept is with Abraham in Genesis 17, where he says, you will have descendants as numerous as the stars and of the sand. He also made a covenant with Moses, that again, reminding him that you will be my people. God makes a covenant with David in 2 Samuel. But it wasn't just God making a covenant. A covenant is one-sided. This is what I will do. I expect it to benefit you, but this is what I will do. Jonathan makes a covenant with David. There's a person-to-person covenant. Ruth makes a covenant with Naomi as a person-to-person covenant. And there's a couple major examples in the New Testament where we have covenant terminology. Guess what this one is? God says marriage isn't a contract where if I get what I want, you get what you want. It's a covenant. You are 100% committed. Jesus speaks of marriage as a covenant between a man and a woman. And the Lord's Supper is a covenant. God saying, this is what I have done. Here's how serious I am about you having a relationship with me. It's a reminder of the covenant, like the rainbow was a reminder of the covenant. That God has done everything for us to be in fellowship with him. Sometimes God uses contracts, but God is also a God of covenant. He reminds us that he is completely faithful and he will never forget. Covenants are different than contracts, and as individuals, we can enter into them as well, but we need to know what we're committing to. They're initiated for the benefit of the other person. I will do this because you need me to do this. That's why God does it. He says, I will always be faithful. I will never forget. And we as people, we don't follow through. God has done everything to be a blessing to us, and he pays the price to be in relationship with us. In covenant relationships, people make unconditional promises. For the benefit to occur, the other person needs to receive the covenant. You have to say, you would do that for me? Okay. They have to make a response like we do when we die to our old life and are buried in baptism and rise to a new life in service of Christ at work in his kingdom. We realize we're accepting a covenant. We're not entering a contract. Covenant relationships are based on steadfast love. In Hebrew, hesed. In Greek, agape. A love that's not fickle, it's not conditional, it's not waiting for the other person to fail. It's totally committed on its own. Contracts are made with anyone, but covenants are made with people that we love. What's John 3:16 say? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. He entered into covenant with us. Covenant relationships view commitment as permanent. Whatever happened to forever, it was replaced with until better. That's not covenant. God is 100% committed to blessing our lives, and he will never forget his promises. Our response to his commitment, that's the focus of next week. How do we, who aren't God, how do we reply and respond back to God? And covenant relationships require confrontation and forgiveness. People fail to live up to the covenant, and when this happens, we need to confront the failures and stand ready to forgive. Even though it's one-sided, you can remind the other party, I've done this, you accepted it, but it's not making a difference in your life. We need to be held responsible for our actions, and we need forgiveness to continue in loving and growing relationships. We're committed to our families and our church and our kids. We're committed. We also have expectations. We want that to encourage them to do better and live better. Forgiveness is the promise that I will no longer hold that failure against you. It's not a feeling or a one-time action. It's, I'm committed to this. You don't have to worry about losing my love for you. I want better for you. God does that with us as well. When God calls us into contract, it's for our benefit, and he warns us of the consequence of breaking the promise. There are a few things in life that God says, do it this way. And if you don't, you're going to bring difficulty into your life. Not that I love you less, but you have a response to me. This is the way I want it done. When God makes a covenant with us, he doesn't do it lightly. Because he knows what it takes to have a relationship with us and how we fail him and we break our end of the agreement. He does so knowing that I'm going to keep you from making this commitment because you can't follow through. God loves us, and he shows it in both covenant and contract. That's God's way of using these terms. And next week, we're looking at the other side. This week, take note of the promises that you've made to God and the ones that he's made for you. That's an interesting study. Take a look at all of the promises that God has made and the promises that we've made back towards God. When God speaks in specifics, we need to obey in specifics. And when he makes a covenant with us, we thank him for making a relationship with him possible. What a blessing to serve our God of covenant, and we're also so blessed by his loving actions to be in relationship with us. God does both contract and covenant, always for our benefit. Next week, we look at our response. We consider, how do we connect with God? How do we use contract and covenant ways? And what I want to do is also tie that into covenant and contract prayer. How is prayer kind of a sign of where we're at mentally in our connection with God? We're going to talk about faithfulness, living a faithful life, the reasons behind why we do what we do. What are our expectations back towards God? And so that'll be part 2.